Our souls are like the lutein bell. And over the period up until the dark night of the soul, it's going to be crusted over with crap. The dark night chips that away, to the point it becomes recognizable. You may have still work to do to make it pristine looking, but that's effectively what the dark night does. Hi there. You can tell I've got a cold. It sounds far worse than it is, but my nose is very runny. And I'm going to be filming this over a number of days, I think, because it's really a reaction, a talk about this book, Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. And it's very personal for myself, because I'm not religious in any way, but I love studying scripture and theology. It's always been something I'm very much interested in. Mainly from a historical point of view is what got me into it. Because I don't think you can really understand Western culture or history unless you consider the role of faith. So this book, St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul, is very much an early 17th century view on Christianity from a monk who was persecuted, imprisoned in Spain because he joined a Carmelite sect that was then banned. And when he was in prison, he started putting together his ideas on explaining a very short kind of poem he wrote and explaining it in detail. So everything is just based on this very small poem, stanzas, called it Stanzas of the Soul. So where he says, on a dark night, kindled in love with yearning, oh, happy chance, he'll then, in one book, go through that line, and he'll go through each part all the way through the book. And as I've written here, this is not for general public, but it's religious. And that has to be borne in mind. The phrase Dark Night of the Soul has been lifted out from its religious context, and in the mainstream has come to refer to a period in life where you could go through some very difficult, dark periods of months or years. I did so when I hit 50, and I don't think it's just for that reason. I don't think it was because I got to that number. I'm 60 now. And for myself, it's not depression, it's not the black dog. I think it's probably closer to what used to be known as the midlife crisis. But really, it's an ego death. It's a stripping away of all the crust that we build as people over our lifetime. And because it's an ego death, you begin to, or the process is you evaluating what matters, what does really matter. Is it chasing fame, fortune, wealth, for instance? Or is it something else? And St. John of the Cross talks about that. It's probably best if I just talk about my own experience. I'm no different to a lot of people, and the dark night of the soul could be seen as a means to elevate yourself spiritually. It can be that, or it's just you overcoming a very dark period. And I began to question, well, mainly work. So my trajectory through life in terms of work was that I've always done well. I've always managed to get jobs, I've always got good paying jobs, and I've always got status-led jobs, a lot of managerial roles. But what does that mean? What is that? It's just vanity. It's like saying, oh, I'm in charge, or I got people below me. And I, unfortunately, fell to really believing my own hype. I don't think I ever lost my sense of humour, But there were periods in which I could be quite cutting and demanding. And I'm talking about now the 1990s. So in the 1980s, I predominantly was in the Royal Navy. And if that is a life lesson, and of course that's the thing that's linked to the dark night of the soul out of its religious context, and even in the religious context, it's life lessons. And the life lessons I seem to have learned in the Navy was follow orders and know your position and do your job and do it well. When I came out, I fell into publishing. And you start from the low and eventually you get up, and success and wealth follows you, and you'll train and you get company cars. But this was in the 1990s, and I can only talk about Britain. It went through a terrible recession in the mid-90s. It went to custard. I went through 3 redundancies, and I came to the decision, most people I came across in positions above me, the people I tended to work for, were narcissists. And to do well in those industries at that time, you had to become similar. You had to fit in. That didn't resonate with me. And because the 3rd redundancy happened, I thought, yeah, I can carry on doing the same old, but I'm going to leave it. And I guess being in the Navy and coming out of the Navy helped. It meant that I was prepared to knock over the toys and say, right, that's it, I'm off, I'm going to do something else. So I went to university. It was a long process to get there. 3 years of night school. Myself as a 30-year-old sitting with 15-year-olds to get my maths and English up to speed, but eventually got there, and then I went to university. The 2000s was change again. My first job in teaching was a head of department. It's unheard of. Did very well, but then decided that we'd emigrate. And if you've ever moved house, you'll know the pressure that can put on you. Well, imagine moving country with young kids. And we were ping-pong poms at the time, so we didn't know where we were going to stay here in New Zealand. My son and I went back, and then we came back, and it was a long process to realise, well, the roots is where you make them. So I hit 50, and you begin to look back on life, as anybody does, and you think, what was it for? And I vividly remember just lying down on the bed, looking up, thinking, why have I had all these problems? Why are people that I tend to come across rinse and repeat of the same behaviour, that they're just dickheads? Why can't I meet, apart from my wife and family, why can't I meet nice people? And I began to question, well, it must be me. And then slowly through this period of dark night, and it lasts quite a while, although in the book, and this is what I would agree with, very much so, and I don't know if I'll be able to find it now. St. John talks about it only lasts as long as is needed, no more. I mean, he says there, which is not exactly what I'm talking about, pass through severe trials and straits by means of spiritual exercise in the narrow way of eternal life, whereof, and of course he's talking about our Saviour, Christ, speaks in the Gospel. The soul ordinarily passes in order to reach this high and happy union with God. Okay, I'm an atheist, but I do believe that there is a God. I just don't follow a religion. A lot there that, okay, if that's the way you want to see it, a Hindu would talk about Brahman and so on. Strip away the language, it's basically saying that you begin to think, well, there must be something more to having to work for people who don't care at work. The great poet Morrissey in The Smiths said, why do I smile for people who I'd much rather kick in the eye, and that kind of stuff. There are so few that enter by it, the dark night, the soul considered it a great happiness and good chance to have passed along it to the said perfection of love, calling this straight road with full propriety, dark night. That it's only as long as is required. It's not necessarily continual and one chunk. You could stop, go a few years, and then other lessons come through to remind you that, hang on, focus on what's really important. So what is really important? Let's imagine you have hit 100. and you're on your deathbed, you know that you're about to slip off this mortal coil, but you're still compos mentis. Will you be thinking, if only I'd worked one more hour at work? No, you wouldn't be thinking that. Would you be thinking, if only I had one more dollar? No, you wouldn't be thinking that. Well, would I be thinking, if only I was a bigger dickhead? No, you wouldn't be thinking that. Mainly because if you were such, you wouldn't be thinking anyway. That's not a thing you'd be talking about. No, you'd be laying there thinking two things. What's next? And was I a good person? Was I, in my case, substitute things for yourself, but in my case, was I a good son, good brother, good husband, good father, good grandfather, probably great-grandfather by then, good mate? But I also would argue that you may not vocalize it, but it will probably be eating away at you, is you'd be thinking, how will I be remembered? What's my legacy? Would people look at me and think, what a... Or would they be thinking, that was a good chap? I get the feeling, and I know this to be true because there are people my age and much older who have never gone through the dark night of the soul. I doubt they'll be having those conversations. I think I'm having it because I went through the dark night of the soul. It makes you reevaluate things, and to openly vocalize publicly without a sense of shame, such as I'm doing now. Whereas before the dark night, I would never be having this conversation. Vanity, ego would kick in. Oh, who are they to hear what I think, and why should I be telling them? It might make me seem weak. So when you go through this difficult process of realizing that everything you've chased after before is probably not what you should have been chasing after, you then question, well, what is then all this? Why did we put ourselves under pressure of debt for all our lives because of property? Why are we changing our personality at work because we believe we have to because we're in a certain position? Why do I treat others with disdain when they're fellow human beings? And so on and so forth. That's a difficult thing to go through. It's a lengthy process for you to question. And I'm not sure about this, but of the 2 or 3 people I do know who've gone through the dark night, they've had similar. You need the ability to just almost fall off the planet and go through this. And if you don't, it just will lengthen the process if it happens to you. So that's my initial take on as to why this is, I think, important. Because as soon as I got to hear about this title, I thought, right. And then I found out it was from St. John of the Cross. I thought, this is definitely worth something to read. There's a lot in here that I agree with, not everything. And I think if he was alive today and non-Christian, he would write it differently. But he was a Christian of his time. And he's going to be using language and words and phraseology and ideas that are very much what I agree with, but he's going to put it in a Christian box. Whereas I would say God or the universe, Spirit, is guiding us towards a certain direction. He'll talk about God and the gospel and Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. Not a problem. So the value of this is extrapolating out some of the big key themes, and there are some heavy hitting themes here. It's not going to be for everyone. And then making it relevant to your own life. So The Dark Night of the Soul. Interesting book. Very interesting language because of its era. And almost difficult to get hold of, but this is not mainstream. Should be, but it's not. And I think it's because it uses saint, cross, and religious words, and it's going to put a lot of people off who would go through and have been through the dark night, but wouldn't be interested in this type of book. So the first thing to consider then is what exactly causes the dark night of the soul to commence? Because you don't expect it. In fact, before it happens, you don't even know there's such a thing potentially. And there's no way you can prepare for it. There's no way I can explain it, really,
mainly because I think it's personal, down to the individual, how it manifests itself. But according to the book, and I agree with quite a lot of what the author says, there's certain things that you can point to that causes the dark night, of which the author calls them imperfections. For instance, he says, a dark night, a purgative contemplation, which causes passively in the soul the negation of itself and of all things referred to, which he's going to talk about. So the dark night of the soul is where you strip away the false ideas that you have as to what you are. But what you really are is what you're trying to get to. Now, I've gone through the book. As you can see, I've made copious notes. Some of the language in which St. John is talking about is obviously very religious and very of his time, 16th, 17th century. So I'm going to have to, I suppose, lay over a lot of the language to make it more accessible to the modern audience, but more importantly to myself. So forgive me, I'll go through, and this is what is, according to John, the causes. Into this dark night, souls begin to enter when God draws them. So in other words, it's not down to you. It's down to the universe, God, source, whatever you wish to call it, putting you in a position where you are now going to go through this inner contemplation, this hard period in which you ask yourself some very difficult questions. Into this night wherein the soul is strengthened and confirmed in the virtues, but it will not be longer than is necessary. I was looking for that, I found it. Interesting, he's talking about virtues, and this is a thing now in the modern context is almost forgotten. The ancients seem to be certainly based on the books that we have from the past, and not everything survived. But they survived because there were multiple copies made, because they were popular. They were scattered all around Europe. So whereas like the library in Alexandria burnt down, and everything was lost, there were other copies of certain books, so we have them, which means that people responded to them. And a lot of them in philosophical, theological concepts talk about virtues, what we should be as people. So when he says, and I'm going to repeat, to be confirmed in the virtues, the dark night is designed to make you fit for purpose. But it won't be longer than necessary. It doesn't say how long it's going to be, and for some people it could be very protracted, I could imagine, but it takes as long as you need. The soul is regenerated, and of course, instantly, so much is coming up into my mind. Define soul, and so on. What does it mean to be regenerated, and so on. And again, this is where the language for myself doesn't fully resonate, but I kind of understand what he's saying. You then end up taking great pleasure in spiritual exercises. And of course, he was a monk. He was a Catholic. So for him, that meant whole nights in prayer, penances and fasts and joys. That doesn't resonate with myself. But in the modern New Age thinking, spiritual exercises is like going for ascendancy and raising your energy and so on. Many blessings are brought through the dark night. Cleanses the soul and purifies it from imperfections. So it's quite stark in what he's saying. It happens because you're not perfect. There's a lot of imperfections that through your life you have built up over yourself. And then he goes on to talk about what they are. And again, he's using very religious language. So it will be pride, and it will be gluttony and avarice and so on. You either accept that for the language that's being used, or you try and adapt it. So let's talk about pride. Satisfaction with your own works and with yourself. I can say I got there in the 90s when I started to ascend in business. I thought I was it. I thought I was the man. Not fully. There were far more narcissists than I ever was. But I said that at the beginning, didn't I? You try to fit in. So you have to become something that you're not. Or I'm not. You are vain. You desire status. You desire all the trappings that come with it. That's not what you should be going for, according to this. Beholding the mote in their brother's eye and not considering the beam which is in their own. Obviously, that's a biblical phrase. It's saying you're finding fault in others, but you're not looking inwardly to yourself. Am I the same? You're anxious that all you do shall be esteemed and praised. Because that's ego, that's vanity. It's like wanting to be seen as great. And that pursuit of wanting to be seen is just sociopathy, it's narcissism. And boy, isn't that prevalent in business. You will want to resolve much and accomplish very little. You're good at talking, but not at walking, that kind of thing. And I see that played out today in politics and entertainment and whatever. It's the big I am. What exactly do? They dislike praising others and love to be praised themselves. They seek out such praise. So remember, this is what is going to bring in the dark night, because that's where you've gone. Though I can't say everybody goes through the dark night, so just by being that doesn't mean this is going to happen. It then goes on to avarice. Like children with trinkets. You want the portfolio. You want the houses. You want the cars. You want the suits. They're trinkets. It's avarice. There's not much else in that particular chapter that resonates with me. He talks a lot about that those at the beginning of the Dark Night are trying to become proficients in the Dark Night towards the end and so on. I'm not really going to talk about that because, again, just let me stress that a lot of the language here is quite tortuous, convoluted, and not modern. But then he gets to chapter 4 and he's talking about luxury, the third sin. He then talks about what causes that, and again, it's very religious. When the soul enters the dark night, it brings these kinds of love under control. In other words, you begin to question, well, does the size of my house mean anything? Am I affected by that? Does that make me a better person? No. Then there is the sin of wrath. I've made quite a few more notes here. Because the language, I just need to express the language here. He starts at chapter 5. Can you see that word there? Concupiscence. Oh, I just realised I've got some on my head. What the hell's that? I've been decorating. That's paint. Yeah, by reason of the concupiscence, very easily become irritated over the smallest matter. They're naturally vexed and disappointed. If you continually chase after things that are like chimeras, you want more wealth. You're not satisfied with the status you have. You go out and try and get more. All that does is makes you irritable. And I've seen so many managers, men and women, who, there was a phrase, they're the backroom boys and girls, but then they get put into the front room and they can't quite handle it. They want the promotion, they want the money, they want the status, but it has an effect on them. They're not focusing on what's real. Just like I wasn't focusing that I was filming with a piece of white spot on my head. Chapter 6 talks about spiritual gluttony, which I don't think really equates at all with the non-religious or modern world. He's really criticising fellow religious people there. Chapter 7 talks about envy and sloth, and there's a lot more there to talk about. So just let me remind you, if you go into the dark night of the soul, it's because you are exhibiting to the world and the universe all these sins, as he calls them. Many of them, and when he says them, it's the people who are about to fall into the dark night. Many of them are wont to experience movements of displeasure at the spiritual good of others, which cause them a certain sensible grief at being outstripped upon this road, so that they would prefer not to hear others praised. I think what he's trying to say here, that people, before you go into the dark night, you are aware that there are others who have probably already done it, or seem to be bit more balanced in life, a bit more grounded. They are a bit more virtuous. They got better attitude towards people. You either hate that because you don't have it, or it makes you jealous. You want it. That's a sign you may be starting to go into the dark night of the soul. For they become displeased at others' virtues, and sometimes they cannot refrain from contradicting what is said in praise of them, depreciating it as far as they can. So these are the people who undermine, and they like to bring other people down because they believe it's building them up. And their annoyance grows because the same is not said of them. For they would fain, great word, we don't use that often now, be preferred in everything. So their narcissism kicks in. Why are they being praised when I'm the boss, so to speak? And I have seen it so often in mom and pop businesses where somebody comes in and they suddenly become better liked than perhaps the owners, and the owners don't like it. And I have been in a company in the 90s where that happened, and that person was soon released. They were too popular. Think about that. People who are exhibiting problems that may bring them to the dark night are irked by the things that are most spiritual, from which they flee, because these things are incompatible with the pleasures that they want. People know in their heart of hearts how they should really be, but they can't be bothered with that when they can go and get more money, and it's just filling up the zeros on a bank balance. And there's an interesting thing here. I've got to equate this or change. I'm going to say it as it's written and then try and make it so it's not necessarily religious. Many of these would have God will that which they themselves will, and are fretful at having to will that which he wills, and find it repugnant to accommodate their will to that of God. It's a two-way thing. People generally want God to will what they want. But when God wants to will something they don't want to know. Now you can take God out of that and you can just put it down as the universe or fate or whatever you want to call it. I want the world to be as I want it. I don't want to conform to what the world has it and I have to conform. No, I don't want that. So that's ego. That's solipsism. That's the world revolves around me. Well, it doesn't. Thus, they measure God by themselves and not themselves by God. Again, if there is an ulterior force beyond ourselves, a lot of people on this planet don't care for that. They don't want a force beyond or bigger than themselves. Again, think why that is. So he's talked about all these reasons, these negative reasons: vanity, ego, pursuing the wrong things. That, if you pursue all that, you may live a long life and die and never ever hear about the dark night of the soul. But for some people, there's obviously something dormant in them that doesn't resonate. And they don't want to fit in with that kind of thing. But they're forced to fit in. And therefore, this inner struggle then breaks out into the dark night of the soul. Midlife crisis, whatever. He finishes off on chapter 7, book 1. They're brought into the dark night. God weans them from the breasts of these sweetnesses and pleasures to an inward darkness, takes from them all these irrelevancies and puerile, causes them to seek virtue. And the key there is takes from them. So, redundancies, moving without a job, loss of something, loss of status, loss of wealth, things that you have built up as bedrocks to stand on, they're taken away. Either through exterior events or yourself whittling them away. Because I've known people to will themselves out of a job. I've seen it. There was a guy I worked with once who got a high status position, plainly wasn't happy that suddenly he realised, oh, this is not for me, and willed it to be sacked. It was amazing to observe. And I spoke to him afterwards, after he was released. Why did you do that? You suddenly started belittling the managers above you and all that. Why did you do that? He said, well, it wasn't me. So we can self-will getting rid of the bedrock below us. And then you may or may not, but generally you may, then start your entrance into the dark night. So the question now is, what then is the dark night? Nice spot for a swim, some batches. You can hear the cicadas right there. So how do you know that you're in the dark night of the soul? Or you'll know alright, though at the time you may not be able to vocalise that you know. And it's hard work. It's certainly not something I would wish on anyone, but having gone through it, I'm glad I did. It's a slow process. You will be full of emotions, often erratic. It's a bit like the 5 stages of bereavement, I guess. You'll have moments of anger, introspection, calm, doubt. It's like sloughing off skin, a snake shedding itself. The mangrove swamp of your mind clears, and you begin to see things differently. The author doesn't really say much about what it's like. I guess it's personal. But what he does do, one of the chapters, it talks about, in a way, how to do it. What things must you adopt or become, I made the notes here, when it comes to the dark night of the soul. You've got to be patient, and you've got to persevere. It's hard work. I assume then some people give up. They probably fall into a deeper slough of despond. But you've got to persevere, be patient, and you have to trust. And that's one of the key lessons. Trust that things will be well. Trust that all is okay. Don't deficit theorize. Don't have lack mentality. And he says here, leave the soul free and disencumbered and at rest from all knowledge and thought. That's almost Buddhist. He's saying release, mindfulness, become a being without anxiety. And that's hard to do. How do you do that? And that's part of the lesson of Dark Night of the Soul. But eventually, that's where you reach. Things no longer trigger you. It's not a case of, oh well, or whatever. That's dismissive. No, it's what will be, will be. But to do all those things, sounds easy, but it isn't. So it is difficult, the dark night. But there are benefits. There have to be benefits, otherwise it's just torture. It's just an unpleasant event in your life that has no meaning beyond that. So what do we get out of it? Are there certain benefits for having gone through the dark night of the soul? And John of the Cross does talk about it. in chapter 12 of the benefits which this night causes in the soul. So there is a reason. And what he's doing, he's setting out in concrete terms what it means. Now, he could be correct. He could say, this is all there is. Perhaps there's more, but this is what he reckons. And I'm just going to thread through that and then say how I found it. Do I agree? Did it happen to me or not? Of course, the language will be different. So he begins by saying that there are many blessings and there are many benefits. One of them, he says, and it's quite interesting use of language here, joy in heaven, because God is now taking this soul from its swaddling clothes, great imagery, setting it down from his arms and making it to walk upon its feet. Which implies then that before the dark night, even when you get to say 50 years old like I was, you're a babe. Your soul is a babe, and it needs to be set free. This is one way of doing that. So like, I guess, birds will push their baby birds out of the nest, this could be seen metaphorically as something similar. Not sure about whether I agree on that or not, but you certainly do come out of it different. He goes on to say, this is the first and principal benefit caused by this arid and dark night of contemplation, is the knowledge of oneself and of one's misery. And he uses here a language very similar to Plato or Socrates, know thyself. He says, know who ye are. So I'm going to talk about that ye before I talk about the other bits. So in English, Old English, the word thee and you are not the same. So you is very formal, but when you say, but thee, we've lost that now. That is a very intimate way of saying you. It's more personal. And it's the same with ye, Y-E. It's not saying who you are, the formal person. It's yourself, the more intimate part of you. Know who ye are. And that, I think, is very important to understand. We're not finding out who we are physically, the you. You're finding out who you are of the soul, the more personal, the more intimate, the ye. And when he talks about the knowledge of oneself and of one's misery, that's interesting. I would say, in my own experience, you have a better understanding of what triggers you and what you should be pursuing. What kind of a personality, a person should you be? If you're only interested in all the things I've talked before about wealth, acquisition and title and status, they're fleeting, they're cursory. They're not you. They could be placed on anybody. What makes you unique is being a good guy or woman, or a good chap or a good chapette. It recognizes its own lowliness and misery, which in the time of its prosperity it was unable to see. So when I was 20, 30, 40, and predominantly in business, I wouldn't have thought about this. I thought I was on the trajectory up. But what it's being said here, I was unable to see. The prosperity got in the way. I could not see the lowliness and misery. Okay, those two words, I can see why he's using it. It's like the Christian idea of sinning. You're a sinner. Lowliness, in other words, be a bit more humble. You're not the big I am. Not sure about the misery, because I would rather see life as being a possibility of joy. But certain things that we chase after do make us miserable, stressed, and unhappy. You can have the biggest house in your town and you could basically have the most wealth. Doesn't mean you're going to be happy. Other things have to be pursued to really make you happy. And chortling and laughing when you're having a big meal when others can't afford it, that's not happiness. So what are you gaining all those things for then? That I agree with. I just don't necessarily agree with the language that he's using. And he says here, another benefit is that you will commune with God with more respect and more courtesy. Okay, from a Christian perspective, highly important. And he did criticize earlier in the book the hypocrisy of people trying to show that they're godly, and they're doing it for show but not necessarily thinking about it internally. So the religious concept of God, I don't necessarily feel in line with. I appreciate it. But to understand that there is a force, greater presence beyond ourself, that I do agree with. Because if I was never born, it would still be there. I happen to be born at this point in which I'm talking to camera. But, therefore, my presence on earth is not required to expect that there is a force beyond me. It's there regardless. The presence of God, this greater presence beyond ourselves, is there, but to commune with it with respect, in other words, to step outside of our solipsistic bubble, there's more to the world than me, that I think is important, and that is a benefit. Because then you begin to see that that force, that power, is inside others. And that's a good thing to learn. But I had that before I went to the Dark Night. I mean, I don't think I learnt that through the Dark Night, but it perhaps reinforced it. Another benefit is to be detached and with regard to affection and sense. You gain a self-knowledge of what you really are. Yeah, I can agree with that. No problem with that. It then talks about the benefit of spiritual humility. The soul is purged from pride to one of love of its neighbours. Pride. Yeah. Pride before a fall. We become prideful. Prideful of our achievements. Prideful of our status, of our authority. And it's not just religions that have a problem with that. It's philosophy as well. Non-religious thought. It's do things together rather than just thinking it's just all down to you. But again, that wasn't necessarily something that I struggled with beforehand. There are other benefits. He said you no longer seek profit. Kind of agree with that. Money isn't everything. You pursue virtues. In other words, you refocus, you recalibrate yourself to follow a path less stressful, less arrogant, less me. That doesn't mean that you're not interested in wealth and comfort. We are human. But it's not that, I think it's you won't pursue it over anything else. It's not that money is a problem, it's that when money grabs you, it takes hold of you is the problem. So it's interesting, and, you know, having talked through the book, because we'll come to an end of the book now, and my own account, I'm not sure I actually have adequately stated how I felt before, during, and after. I don't think I can. I wouldn't want to go through the dark night of the soul ever again. Don't think I need to, but I'm glad I did it. I can see the real benefit of having done it. It stripped away all the BS that I was involved with beforehand and trying to prove things and blah, blah. Has it made me a better person? Not really. I'm still prone to sarcasms and blah, blah, blah like anybody else. But generally, I'm not. If it happens to somebody who I love or know or through the internet, I could say, I know what you're going through, but you're on your own. This will be unique to yourself if you go through it. Know that you're not the first ever to go through it. Know that there's a guy who came up with the title, and as far as he's concerned and his background, he explained it in a way that made sense to him and many people afterwards, and still does. But if you're not Christian, if you're not religious, it will still be called Dark Night of the Soul, and you will come across books and stuff online that can help you go through it. Know that that is the case. You're not alone. But there are also reasons why it's happening, and if you strip away all those needs to get rid of, those things, that encrustation, at the end you're going to be better. And I think I'll finish off just by giving a little story that helped me get through the dark night. So the dark night was coming to an end when I started writing my 2 books. Throughout the whole of that period, it was like shards of time just separated. It's almost as though something happened to time. I can't believe that almost 2 years went by and I was in this fog. And when I looked back, I thought, where's that time gone? Large swathes, I don't remember things. That was probably stress. It was a way of protection. But it was like that. It was bizarre. A lot of people say they went through the same thing with COVID. They look back and think, 2-3 years just went like that. And we don't know how to process that, how to equate that. But I went through that period. And as I was coming out of it, trying to make sense of what's just happened, I felt renewed. I thought, how do I ever explain this to anybody? And because I was starting to write the books that I've written about the history of the Navy, the Royal Navy in the late 1700s and early 1800s, I came across the story of HMS Lutine, just a simple frigate, which went down off the coast of the Netherlands, and many ships similar were lost at sea, sunk, or whatever. And this ship was forgotten for a long time, up until the mid 1800s, when it was found, and they found the ship's bell. They brought it up. It'd been on the ocean floor for at least 50, 60 years, and you could not tell the shape of the bell. It had so much encrustation around it, barnacles and stuff. It was just this amorphous blob. Someone dutifully over years chipped away at that encrustation to reveal the rough shape of the bell, and continued to chip away and then, polish the brass to the point that eventually the Lutine bell was presented to Lloyd's of London, and it still hangs up there and is rung to this day if any ship goes down. And then effectively the underwriters have to look at the insurance claim and whatever. That's what Lloyd's of London was set up for. The Lutine bell, beautiful bell, but it was out of shape. It was unrecognizable. And then through a really long process, chipping away, buffing up, it became this wonderful piece that now is like an icon in London. Our souls are like the Lutine bell. And over the period up until the dark night of the soul, it's going to be crusted over with crap. The dark night chips that away, to the point it becomes recognizable. You may have still work to do to make it pristine looking, but that's effectively what the dark night does. It makes you question the shape that you're in, your soul. Not your body, your soul. The bit we don't see, but we know is there. The mind, the soul. The chipping away is not physical, but you're still getting rid of all that crustaceans, those barnacles. You do it by questioning, reevaluating, and then adopting. So rather than being always angry, you infrequently become angry, and so on. You reforge what you are. Because remember, we will not be remembered for the clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the houses we live in. We will be remembered for the personality, the person we are. You're kind, considerate, peace-loving. Do you have humility? That might require a dark soul for you to get there. And it doesn't happen to everyone. Not every ship's bell that's on the bottom of the sea has ever been found. So the Lutine bell also tells us that not everybody's going to go through the dark night. But if it does happen to you, if you are receptive to it to begin, that's a good sign. And although it's going to be difficult, at the end of it you will come out hopefully a better person. That does not mean you're better than anybody else. The dark night of the soul doesn't mean that you're going to go from one dark personality to a lighter personality and be better than anybody else. It's not that. This is not something that you'll be standing up on the rooftop saying, look at me, aren't I great? No. I needed the dark night of the soul because I wasn't like that, the person I wanted to be. And the universe obviously had a plan. Well, we're going to help you, but it's going to be long and hard. So, although I would not want to go through it again, and I would not wish it on anybody, I'm glad I went through it. There are many books like this. Many books that, not very long, but very challenging. Kudos to St. John of the Cross for having, as far as we know, put this down and talked about it in his book Noche Obscura del Alma, providing a signpost, if nothing else, for what could be a difficult journey for a lot of people. If you have got this far, and I know this is going to be a very long video, and it's also not going to be a video, I don't think, of interest to most people. It's too personal, unless you're going through the dark night or you feel you're about to. Who's going to be wanting to know about this kind of stuff? So I don't expect it to get much traction. I'm also not sure I should really do it, because what benefit could it be? But I'll put it out there. At least it'll be a record for somebody in the future. Yeah, the dark night of the soul. That's it. Ta-ta for now.